Well, good evening, everyone, also from my side. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Marta Hanson, who publishes widely on the history of medicine in China, public health in East Asia, and connected early modern Sino-European medical history. Just a brief biography. She was assistant professor of late imperial Chinese history at the University of California in San Diego, and associate professor of East Asian medical history in the History of Medicine department, Johns Hopkins University. And to add something more, she was president of the International Society for the History of East Asian Science, Technology, and Medicine, and is now the vice president of the International Society for the Critical Study of Divination, whose center is in this building. And currently, she is an associate with her project of CAS-E. I'm really glad you are. We are old friends and colleagues. She has also acted, Marta has acted as a member of our advisory board of the International Consortium for Research in the Humanities. She has also been the senior co-editor of Asian Medicine, the Journal of the International Association of Traditional Asian Medicine, and remains on the editorial board. There's a book which I should mention, which is entitled Speaking of Epidemics in Chinese Medicine, Disease and the Geographic Imagination in Late Imperial China. For this place, it is also, I think, of a great interest that within cross-cultural medical history, she still has an ongoing collaboration with Jana Marta, who is a historian of early modern Europe, on 17th to 18th century translations of Chinese medical texts into European languages. And there are articles that have issued from this collaboration. For instance, medicinal formulae and experiential knowledge in the 17th century epistemic exchange between China and Europe. And since we are all here highly interested in epistemics, both scholars have developed a concept of epistemic genres, which might perhaps also be mentioned today. I still don't know, which is an article that is called Epistemic Genre as a conceptual tool in the history of Chinese medicine. So I'm really glad that we have you here as an associate, and we are all looking forward to your talk. And please join me in welcoming Marta Hanson.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that warm introduction. I'm very pleased to be in this group and have had a chance over the past 6 weeks since I arrived to get to know many of you in the open circle and different sessions and listening to your own talks. The ethnography workshop that we had for 3 weeks with Paul Stoller. And so I'm presenting my material today with two very clear ends for me, shamelessly, hoping to harvest from your collective intelligence in the room and whoever is online as well. And one is to introduce the Knowing Hands Project. One is to introduce the Knowing Hands Project. So hopefully some of you in the room or online, it'll spark something, or something that I say will spark something in your own research that relates to what I'm going to be talking about. And we have 30 entries for an online exhibition that will also come out as a printed catalog of the next 2 years. So there's still some room to bring in some new people. Then the second thing is I'm going to conclude with my own unpublished research on a particular esoteric Buddhist text and finger sealing. So using the fingers as a modality to seal people and treat them and other things. And I'm going to, you got it going. Thank you. So the first is to introduce thank you so much, Dan, the Knowing Hands Project with that in mind, a broad overview of what we're doing, what we mean by epistemic hands and mindful hands. Then I'm going to go into a specific example from a daily use encyclopedia from the working group that I worked on and have worked on with the working group that I'm part of at Max Planck. And then Divination Revelation is going to be an introduction to how I got involved in this topic in the first place. And I'm going to ask you to indulge me and actually do something with your hands and a divination relevant to the time that we will arrive at when I come to that section of my talk. And then I'm going to conclude, hopefully, in a good pace on making the invisible visible, which is where I want to introduce some theoretical perspective that I find useful for dealing with this old Buddhist text and the hand illustrations in them and the whole ritual healing process that text is about. Hopefully we'll get there. Knowing Hands Project. Obviously, we're based here. I'm very happy to be based here, and it comes directly out of my many years of engagement with ECAGF, definitely. And my partner, Stephanie Homola, also engaged with ECAGF over the years. She's an anthropologist in France, and I'm an historian. And so together we put our collective experience and knowledge together to create a proposal that we now have based here. This is the abstract for it and the title. And what I decided to do is just unpack the title for you for the first part. Chinese hand memory techniques and handy knowledge, in situ comparison and contact. So what we mean by those specific words. Hand memory technique, this is something very common. How many people in the room have used this to remember the number of days in the 12 months? I see a few heads nodding. Who prefers the knuckle method over the verse? Doesn't matter. Some people prefer the verse. Okay, but often mnemonics, oral mnemonics go with these hand mnemonics. Fleming's right hand rule is common in physics, where the three fingers are used as the X, Y, and Z axis. There's a right hand and a left hand rule. I'm not going to go into it more. And this is one that I just made up, which is a gift to all of you. Just take your hand out, left or right, doesn't matter, the three fingers, and imagine it being a telephone keypad, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It is very useful, I found, to project or to tap out things like your flight number or something, and also people's numbers. But there's lots of numbers that we need to know just for a short ephemeral time. So that's my little gift to you in the beginning of the key, that hand mnemonic. Now, in situ, first part of our project is what's happening in China and in the broader East Asian sphere or in the Sinosphere. This is the earliest example I found, dates the 8th century and was found in Dunhua caves, which I'll come back to in part 4 when I talk about making the invisible visible. And what's interesting about this hand mnemonic, it's just 10 virtues, Buddhist virtues. You read on your hand going from left to right, 10 different ones. And then it has the 5 Buddhist elements, which get repeated, starting with the thumb, space, wind, fire, water, earth. Okay. And then you have the names of the fingers, and on the left hand's associated with fortune and the right with knowledge. So this may have been part of meditative practices. It was included in a manuscript with mudras, that is different ways of forming the hand for symbolic meanings is important in Buddhism. But there's no other explanation whatsoever. It's very different from this example, which is what I'm currently have not done, except for I have published a translation of everything here. It's possibly dated it's attributed to someone in the 7th century, probably more likely current 8th and 9th century, but we don't have any evidence of it till this text that was published in the Taisho Tripitaka Buddhist text, and is dated to 1152. And here we have very different kinds of functions of the fingers. Each phalangeal division is considered to be an eye, calling up spirits, having a power to not do internal work like the earlier one, I would say is internal work, but to do external exorcisms to affect the world outside of it. The next 11th century is the earliest example in medicine I have published on, and it has to do with calendrical coordinates of the 60-year cycle in China, the 12 branches, the 10 stems. And what I find very interesting is the bottom hand does not have actually the 12 branches written out on the fingers, because I think, and I've argued this before, it could be assumed knowledge at the time. The earliest edition we have is from the 1339. But what's interesting about this is that it's completely cognitive. There's no attempt to do something external like the previous one. So very different function of the hand. 13th century, more common to the medical one I just showed you, having to do with memorizing the 5 sounds and 36 phonetic finals that are very important in Chinese literature and poetry. 15th century, we see a proliferation of examples. The one on the left is related to divination method, or calculating, in this case, calendrical coordinates. The one in the center is from the Taoist canon and has to do with a ritual related to pacing through the Ursa Major. And then the one on the right is really mathematical treatise and working out basic arithmetic and algorithms in that way. We see, that's just to show how the circle chart and the hand chart are related, which is commonly the case. And what's really interesting, I think, here in the 17th century manuscript, that you don't even need to have the hands illustrated anymore. It's just known that these division of the 12 branches is referring to how you would use them on the hand. Just like the hand example I showed you before, they don't even put the 12 branches on it because it's assumed you would know. So in comparison, what we're talking about is other examples of the way hands are used to think with, or to think through things. And this catalog from 2000 was really important. It was published out of Folger Shakespeare Library. And at the time when you'll see, I was exposed to these practices in the same time when just a year after when this catalog came out. And what I started to read was Arts of Memory in Europe. But most of the book, all of them actually focus on visual and auditory and not on bodily arts memory. But this catalog did feature really interesting examples of hand memory techniques. The one on the far left is associated with Guido of Aleppo. And the earliest example we have is the manuscript above, I think, in the 12th century. It's for music, choral music. I'll come back to that. The one in the center has to do with spiritual ends. They're Catholic meditation practices associated with the 5 fingers, which I will also carries into the present, actually, an example I'm going to show you. And even the Jesuits had a 5-finger meditation example in Ignatius Loyola's Exercita Spirituala. And then this last one is very famous, where the hand is just being used as a placeholder for a range of whatever different kinds of knowledge. And it's just symbols put on the hands. And you could go to this Pope Francis has 5 fingers, and in line with Pope Francis, what Pope Francis is known for, the Pope of the people. The first one, you thank your family. The second one, you thank your teachers, etc. The third one, those who are in power. The fourth one, which is your weakest finger, to recall the poor, the people who are wanted things, to have them in your prayers. And of course, the pinky, the smallest finger, is you. Now, in contact, what do we mean by contact? We have a couple examples, not much, but nonetheless, it's something, where the Guido's hand was translated in the 1680s, 1690s period for the Kangxi Emperor. And we see the Chinese hand version of Guido in this slide. And I just cite the article where they call it to our attention. And then the Chinese hand for 12 halftones is translated into French by the Jesuit Amiot in the 1779, and this is the 1780s example of it. So we have specific examples where we have, I hope I can I actually, okay. So this is just published in 2025 by a member in our academic network, Addie Liu. What I want to show you is that he's using GIF files to show the movement through the hand. Okay, and then also this particular movement that's important for the Guido's hand, which we will be including in the exhibition. And then he has a video as well, how you actually use the hand. Part of the exhibit will be to actually put in the print version movement. So these are just quick examples of how to do that. The GIF file, the video file, animation, spreading it out so people can learn how to do it. Because the idea is in each entry, people can actually read, listen, watch, and learn what the knowledge is that's projected onto the hands, whatever language they are. And so this is another way to map it with the numbers so that each time you move through the finger, you would get a definition of what the Latin is. And this one is a way of moving through, and then he indicates with the broken lines where you jump from one finger to the next and then slide down to do the Ritos. And I was scared to go to this catalog, and the online exhibition, so I'm going to just move on. This is our model for the whole Knowing Hands project, and we're simultaneously working on the online exhibition and the catalog at the same time, working out how to do, because printed version is different from what you can do online. So epistemic hands and mindful hands is a distinction we've been working with and thinking about what is handy knowledge, because it's Chinese memory techniques and handy knowledge. One thing I wanted to get across is there's very specific reading strategies that I have to read for the reader and other people's bodies. So other people's bodies would be patients and clients. And then when the text is asking you to do something with your body, I really pay attention to that. And then when they're asking you to do something with your hands, I've come up with two different types of ways that hands are being used. And I think that the distinction in cognitive science between extended cognition and embodied cognition really captures that. Now, I tend to work with the primary sources, shop it down, and then I find something that I think fits. And so that's why I'm using cognitive science in this context. Handy knowledge is often common knowledge, doesn't always get textualized. Bodily knowledge, also very late to be textualized and put into text. It's not valued as much. We're thinking about handy as something that's at hand, accessible, obviously, cognitively handy as well. And that's where epistemic hands comes in, that people are projecting onto their hands in very specific ways, different types of order of knowledge. And physically handy. So this is when you actually have your mind at the tip of your fingers and you're doing things in a mindful way. I brought in Heidegger because German audience don't normally bring up Heidegger, but I think that it does make sense, his Was heißt denken, or what is called thinking, in that he emphasizes so much the hand. Hands are what set humans apart. They sign, they're signifying, etc. Creatures, hands are, in his words, monstrous or monstrum in Latin. They set us apart from animals in his writing, and also demonstrate, which comes from the same root, or indicate things, to monstrate. And so they especially think, according to him, in handiwork or handiwork in English. So he brings up the carpenters and the joiners and the cabinet makers. But in the history of science, this mindful hand has been very influential in thinking about the relationship between episteme on the one side and techne on the other, and how there's a real binary historically between the two. But in looking at manual labor and theoretical invention, this book really presents very interesting cases about how they're linked processes with the people working together and what they divide into handy minds, mind type people who work, who can work with their hands and they value those who do. And the mindful hand people who are more hand oriented and et cetera. So I just signal that this is where my mindful hand reference for the material I'm working for comes out of, as I'm trained in history of science. So read for when readers' hands are addressed, I'm reading for textualization of any kind of body hand-centered practice, and when they give step-by-step instructions of how to do bodily things, which is why I really like this esoteric Buddhist text. It's a real DIY kind of manual. And then determine, the reader or somebody has to interact with other people, patients, clients, adversaries, et cetera. And now we're going to do a deep dive into one primary source that I work with for my own work, but also we work with broadly in the Common Knowledge Working Group at Mox. So this is a 1641 daily use encyclopedia. You get lots of interesting information. And in this case, I'm featuring a patient's hand. It's actually a child's hand, because in pediatric text, you can't talk with a child, but you can read their fingers and hear 3 stages for the level of fever and such. For the vein really pops out for the children. And so that's an example of what I call a patient's hand. Don't have this example in this particular text, but clients' hands, or of course faces and bodies, are used in physiognomy. This is from a picture I took in Taiwan. But in this text, there's really interesting examples of both what we call epistemic and mindful hands. And for the people who read Chinese, it's clear that this is calculation studies, archery and boxing, and how to play the chin. In this case, this is a within the sleeves method where you have to use the 12 branches to calculate things, basic in this case, market prices and stuff. I'm not going to give you the examples, and you start here at the base of your ring finger and you move clockwise around and you end at the base of your index finger for a total of 12. This is a very common method. Saw it already. And we see here examples again of it used for the 12 zodiac animals and then linking to astral, baleful, and auspicious stars. And this is an old edition of a very early encyclopedia from the Song period. Now, in extended mind hypothesis, which I think many of you are aware of, I find it really useful to think of this analogy between Olga, who could remember where to go. This is the Baltimore Museum of Art where I lived at the time I made the slide. And Otto's notebook, Otto, who needs a notebook because he's suffering from Alzheimer's and can't get to the museum on his own. And they say both are able to get to the museum, but Otto needs to use his notebook. And he does use his notebook, he's able to get there. And that's an example of extended cognition, that the notebook external to Otto is functioning, outside of the mind to help Otto. And my mother, who had Alzheimer's for the last decade of her life, functioned very well with all of her things laid out and her notebook and everything that she carried with her. And so I really could see this in practice and appreciate their example here. In this case, there's some history of science too work, Anne Blair and Lorraine Daston, on the importance of note-taking and taking note and how important it is to actually write with your hand rather than typing in the computer to recall things. When I were back to my opening image, which I really love, this is an astrologer who's sitting at a table with his assistant, probably a client as well, on the right side, and he's doing something with his left hand. I think he's actually doing one of these kinds of hand divination techniques. And what interests me is connecting what's in his mind with his hand, right? And so this is, I think, a good example of extended cognition. Embodied cognition is different. It's that the way the body interacts with the environment, that our concepts of the world, like up and down, et cetera, are grounded in our sensory experiences. And I find this very useful for what I see in this text of mindful hands, things that are physically handy, they're embodied in the hands. And the example I have here is not just a list of how the 5 fingers are named, which is important for learning how to play the zither. So you see here on the bottom examples of how to play the zither as well. That is, and then many different ways of explaining how to pull the strings, and in other encyclopedias, you actually have birds and animals doing different things as analogies for how to play the strings. And how to hold a bow and arrow. Has anybody tried to hold a bow and arrow? Everybody tried it. It's difficult. Yeah, somebody's nodding. And I find this a very interesting textualization of how to do that. Because at this time in the Ming, military strategy and knowing how to do military things is highly valorized. And we see that in this daily use encyclopedia, and also how to box is also one of these things. So I think the playing the zither, the holding, archery and boxing in this source is an example of what I'm trying to say about embodied cognition in the hands. And the far left, is the epistemic hand, and the other 3 are what I'm calling mindful hands. Andy Clark has done so much more on extended mind, but I just want to bring out this point that he makes in Supersizing the Mind, that there's an incorporation of a tool. So in this case, you see the monkey, using the stick to get at some food in the tree, right? And he has many examples of how the brain recalibrates automatically to take account of new bodily and sensory opportunities through the stick. And I think it's comparable to think about acupuncture. You need to have the mind at the end, not of your fingers, but the end of the needle. The same with the moxa. See how carefully she's holding her hands to make sure she doesn't burn the person. It's Artemisia mugwort, and putting heat on a particular point. And in calligraphy, which is the highest form of art in China, because your blood, your qi is going through the brush and into the ink, and your calligraphy is exemplary or a manifestation of who you truly are. And the historical questions I have is when are these kind of things written down? In what kind of genres do knowing hands appear? these daily use encyclopedias, the working group I'm part of at MPI, are really rich repositories, and they are actually going to be using machine learning to track all the hands. And so we can do a real analysis of the many different editions we have from China. And then what other, when and what kind of genres do you get tools incorporated? Let me give you an example of how I answer these questions. So in the Huangdi Neijing Ling Shu, which is the earliest theoretical canon of Chinese medicine, dating to, it's anonymous, but first century BCE, and then we get actual textual versions of it from the 7th century on. And in this text, you see a close attention to how the physician holds how they should be, how their attention should be, and how their spirit should be. And in the end, he must be one with his own spirit and project his intent, his mind, into the needle. So that's carries through all the way to the present. And one person in the working group shared with me this example of how to hold a calligraphy needle. Not a needle, sorry, a calligraphy brush, excuse me. And instructions, it's complicated actually if anybody's tried to do Chinese calligraphy to get the hold right, So that's the kind of historical questions we're asking. And since I'm in a room with a whole bunch of anthropologists, I thought I would bring up some anthropological ideas that are influencing my own. And it comes to the very famous Balinese cockfight, and of course, Clifford Geertz' Deep Play article from the 70s. But the way I'm thinking about it is a French anthropologist who summed up an essay on how the hand plays in anthropological work in terms of how it relates to how anthropologists think about the relationship between hand and la pensée, or thinking. And he argues that really there's a major division in anthropology. You who are actually trained in anthropology seriously can correct him or if he's wrong, between how Geertz approached the Balinese cockfight and how Bateson and Mead did. I think it's very interesting. He said, Geertz, and he sees the cockfight as symbolizing social life. The cock is the Balinese cockfighter's double. But with George Bateson and his work with Margaret Mead at the time, which was earlier than Geertz, he records how the Balinese themselves thought about their birds and that they do not represent them, but rather they are an extension of themselves. That the cock, like their own hands, has a life of its own. And I think that they're not, writing in terms of extended cognition, et cetera, but they at that time, but Nicholas Adele is thinking, and I'm definitely. I published on this a Batesian on these grounds. Okay, transition to the origin, divination and revelation. So 2001, this is just a year after that Folger Shakespeare catalog was published. I'm preparing for a conference in France, Image and Action. It ended up becoming this important book. And I was planning to present on things that I was working on for my book, which were images and diagrams and medical texts having to do with epidemiology. Because I was very interested in basically doing justice to the complexity of how Chinese thought about epidemics and debated between themselves before Western medicine came in, et cetera. And I found that a lot of these diagrams were about ways of predicting epidemics. And these are the main texts I was working with. They had lots of images. Specifics don't matter so much as that they were from the mid 16th century to the mid 18th century. This is the kind of thing I was working on, how the circle diagrams relate to the mnemonic devices and relate to these tables that were predictive of epidemic type years, et cetera. And I was trying to, work that into a chapter into my book. But at that time, I was at the Institute for Advanced Study, and I was waiting for my colleague, Zheng Jiafeng, to come to visit me because they have the best library, one of the best libraries in the U.S., CAS-E library. And I went out in my old Cutlass Sierra Oldsmobile with my dog, and I heard this. I thought, I'm not going to be able to make it all the way to the Newark airport to pick up Jiafeng. So I pulled over to the gas station. And they're like, yeah, your exhaust pipe is hanging out the back. There's no way, you got to leave the car here, and we'll see you, in a few days or next week. And unfortunately, it's not that far. So I walked across back to the institute and and waited. And I was kind of worried because the bus is not so regular from the Newark airport to the institute. And suddenly, 10:30 or so, she calls. great. I'll tell you where to go, but I'll take this. And, it was probably back in time for lunch. Next day, we're in the guest library. There are these big tables. They're sitting across from each other. She's working on pediatric texts. It's open stacks, etc. It's just a wonderful library. And I don't know why I thought this, but I thought, if I had been at the airport, I probably would have waited for me to arrive, and waited for the car to arrive and then called. Like, I would not have immediately called. So I asked her, why did you call me? You must have called just getting up. We don't have what we have today. You have to go to a phone booth. And we don't have cell phones or anything. And she said, yeah, I called you right after I got off the plane. I'm like, well, why did you do that? Oh, I did a calculation. I landed here, and it wasn't the worst thing, but it was not a good thing either. So I figured you weren't in problem, but you probably weren't going to be able to come pick me up. What are you talking? And she drew this and proceeded to explain to me that she only uses a lunar calendar. You have to have the month, the day, the hour of the day. And, then you go through the calculation, and it kind of helps her. Can't do it for serious things, but helps her for just mundane questions, like when she had a doubt about whether I was going to be able to pick her up at the airport. I was just completely confused. What are you talking about? And she proceeded to, tell me that they have their own designations. She had numbered it A through F. This is she told me that it's a kind of a finger divination method here, Chajari Swan. She gave the lunar month, the 6th of October, the 24th day. And when you look at this, there's a mountain, ACE are positive outcomes, and BFE are the relatively negative ones. So there's 6 possible prognostications. And the ones C and F are the best and the worst. And I would say D and E are the middle. E is a kind of middle range, and A is the least good, and D is like the middle bad, and B is the least bad, and the F is the worst bad. So she went on, and I want to tell you what she's dealing with is not natal anthropology, where your coordinates are from the past, or future, which is electional, but the present, or exact time or hour when you ask a question, or when the parent asks the question, or beginning of a sickness, for example, but it has to do with present. And the next summer I had a chance to be in Taiwan. So she drew another, we revisited this thing, this technique, and she uses her right hand. So I would like you to take your right hands out and think, or your left hand, you could take your right, left. I actually have another slide where you can think about this. You have the 6 on these, or you can put it on your fingertips, but the mountain one like that and the valley one like this. She had 6 numbers. She had 3 numbers, the lunar month, the day, which was 24, and usually use the hour when something is happening to do it. But she likes to tailor it to herself, so she used a number of strokes that came in the first character to her mind, but you can also use a number of strokes in the person last name who's asking the question for the diviner. There's lots of different variations that Stephanie and I have been coming up with, because we're doing our templates for this Knowing Hands project together right now. And let's do it. Okay, I have this slide ready for you to do it yourselves. So take your left hand out. In the certain rules of the game, you have to start always at Da'an, or great peace, great security, and you have to move clockwise. And with the next second and third number, you start at the same place you just landed. So we're going to do this together. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Right? And you land on the worst possible outcome, but we're not going to stay there very long. Now it's 24. That's a lot to count, and it's tedious. So the calculation they do in their head is 7, because you're going to land here again with 7, and then 6 after that. So we can minus 19, and we only have 5 more to go, but you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We land here. And the same rule applies for the first number, as you can minus 7, so we don't have to go 9. We can just do 2, and we land on Da'an. That's where she landed when she decided, all right, that's on the peak, but it's the worst of the positive outcome. I'm going to give her a call. Now, today is the first day of the 5th lunar month. It's very easy now to find it online. At that time, Jiafeng carried a little converter piece of paper or booklet with her to do this. And then the next coordinate, is zodiac hours. That's the third one. So we have 1 for, right? We have 1 for the month, 5 for the day, and then we have 11 for the third number. And the Chinese divide up their hours of the day in 2-hour units, starting between 23 o'clock and 1 o'clock in the morning. So that's the hour of the rat you see at position 12 on this chart. Then you move around to ox for, 1 to 3, tiger, rabbit, dragon, snake, horse, goat, and monkey, rooster. And then now we are in the hour of the canine or the dog between 19, or we soon will be between 19 and 21. I feel like I need to pause for this. So let me just make sure everybody understands. You're going to move starting in Da'an, right? You move clockwise around and you stop and you restart from where you started before. And then you land on a certain position. And before I give the numbers out, you should have something in mind, all of you right now. That's a little doubt, not a big doubt, a little doubt, but something that's present for you today. And I want you to bring that to the forefront of your mind. And those of you who are watching to do the same. I'm going to give you a little time to think about that. So now that you have that in your mind, you can tailor the third number by the first character that comes to mind, for those of you who know Chinese, and for those of you who don't, maybe you have a lucky number you'd like to use instead. You could tailor it to yourself. But the main idea of this divination process for the people that do it is to situate themselves in the lunar calendar, in this temporal spatial temporal cosmology, because that by situating themselves in that spatial temporal cosmology, it allows them to make the best decision that's right for that moment. They often say yin shi, yin di, yin ren, which is according to that time, that place, and that person. And this way of thinking of being immediately present for what's appropriate now is what this kind of divination is about. And we see it in so many areas of Chinese culture. Of course, we think of Taoism, the Wu Wei, and Chinese philosophy, but it just permeates medical thinking and many other parts of Chinese military strategy, etc. All right, so now we're going to do this. So have in mind what you have. Everybody take your hand out. So it's quite easy. Da'an, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We land on Shaoji, small fortune. 1 day. We're on the first of so we just stop there. We minus 7 from 11, so we just have to move 4. But some of you might have some other numbers. You go ahead and do your thing. 1, 2, 3, 4. Success, prompt joy. It's the best you can have. It's on the peak. So I want you to think about what you had in mind, and then think about what that divination changed in your mind. Does it make you think about acting in a different way than what you would have before you first had that doubt? Now, it was amazing because as soon as she went off to go into the guest library to find her pediatric text, I told you they're open stack, I came across these images in my medical text. I didn't see them. Hand mnemonics, there's a couple of them. And not only that, an entire essay on how to use what they call pointing to the palm explanation. That's what the original text actually from 1624 looks like. I had completely new questions for the meeting in Paris. What kind of medical doctrines are written on the hand? How were these mnemonics related to other diagrams? Where they learn this? How did they use it as a calculating instrument? Was it a broader phenomenon in China and elsewhere in the world? And what range of conceptual work did these hands do? So when I went to Paris, I gave a crazy talk, had everybody using their hands and, really thinking of the hand itself as a tool or as an image, the diagram. So now again, I want you to take your hand, and this is an example of how thinking through the hand is different from thinking with the hand, in the way I'm thinking. So the hand, and this is in the very beginning of that essay I just showed you on explanation of pointing to the palm. The tip of your finger is south and your wrist is north. This directionality is important, and this is east and this is west. And the heaven is the celestial phenomenon is written out with these characters on the fingers, and what's considered to be earthly phenomenon is in the square part of your hand. I've included Chinese for those who can read it. Master Xiaoyong is somebody from the Song Dynasty who turns out to be extremely influential in medical thinking, and I would say also in Chinese philosophy more broadly. He talks about the four seasons, the four directions related to the four limbs, so this kind of macrocosm, microcosm thinking. Then he says, with the joints of the fingers, we observe heaven, but with the lines of the palm, we examine earth, and that heaven and earth is within one's grasp or in the palm. So this is why I'm calling my book Grasping Heaven and Earth, right, the one I'm working on now. Now, when he says the back of the palm is high and the front is low, he means here that this is high and this is low, and that the earth's more mountainous northwest. This is in this corner, so this would be like Xinjiang and that area. And together, these lines go down to the southeast. So if you hold your hand like you're catching a ball, like a softball, if you just look at the way it falls naturally, it has a slant down. And the way he imagines this is that these are the rivers of China, that this is Ming China, the time. These are the Northwest Mountains, and this is the low-lying Southeast region. I'm just going to pull out now where I think the example I gave you before of using the hands to think with is still different from using the hands to think through things like macro-microcosm relationships, which I just gave you, is to think about how scientific instruments like the stethoscope extend the ability of the ear to hear what's inside the body, and the telescope extends the eyes, of course, to see the heavens. But that divinatory instruments are also examples of like scientific instruments, and they extend the possibility of thinking or facilitate cognitive thinking. And it brings me back to my lovely diviner with his hand and a divinatory instrument functioning in, I think, that way. All right, so I find epistemological polyglot an interesting way of summarizing how I apply multiple frames to this phenomenon. So the first one I do think of and have written about this particular method and other methods like it as exemplifying extended mind and as technologies and effective technologies of the mind. They do affect people's decision-making and they help them navigate the world. And also I think it's important to practice historical embodiment, do them yourself. Otherwise you have no idea what they're doing or the logic behind it. So I also have written about that. Now, for the practitioners, as I said before, it's really important to situate themselves in that spatio-temporal coordinate system of their cosmology, because they are also harnessing the energies of the spirits, the astral projections, and et cetera, associated with these time and space. So I find that this kind of epistemological multilingualism facilitates an epistemic partnership, which I think is part of the alternative rationalities and esoteric practices research group here. And it is indeed the case with Zhang Jiafeng, who is, I would say, my most important Chinese colleague and interlocutor. We share book manuscripts, and I continue to learn a great deal from her. But it's also is comparable to doing justice to unpacking and carrying out good philological analysis on historical materials. So how historical actors themselves thought, what categories they had in their alternative rationalities. So part 4, I'm very inspired by Emily Martin Ahern. Philip Clark raised her point about there being 2 different types of divinatory methods in China. One, when set is when you need to communicate with the gods, and another one where it's not about communicating with any sentient beings, but rather understanding forces and processes that operate in the world. So I think that this effort to communicate with gods via persons, deities, material objects, and it's necessary to have a body or a proxy body. And the other one, an effort to reveal causal or other connections concerned with forces and processes, embodiment is not necessary at all. So Ahern doesn't talk about this, I think that this is an important distinction I've learned in my own work and I'm putting out into the world. So, for example, a divining chair in China is very important for mediating, making visible the invisible. But for the Book of Changes, you don't need anything like that. So that's an example, I think, of the second type of divinatory practice that Ahorn distinguishes in her book. And also the hand mnemonics. This is a very famous example in fiction of a fictionalized version of a general doing shoujian ke underneath his sleeve and then determining what the news is from a distant about the war at the time in Changsha. So he doesn't need to have his hand. He's some kind of like what we just did with the hand divination, but it certainly makes it faster for him to work it out. Spirit writing, we're going to have an example of that coming up. I think that the planchet and the use of the stick is a very important proxy body, I would say, where the body is required. And we have a plug for the ritual that's going to be taking place here in Erlangen and Nuremberg. I'm very inspired by Webb Keen on his spirit writing, materialities of language, and the religious work of transduction. And what he does in transduction, or this idea, is argue that in the process of working with materials and changing the materials, you have something that transforms into something else and makes through the material visible the invisible. Am I supposed to stop right now, or can I run through this? Well, I'll just go through it. Okay. So he's arguing that people experience. He's basically bringing materiality into religious studies. It's not only language, but music, other things that are are part of the semiotic practice. But what he really focuses on in this article, which has been influential to me, and this is why I'm presenting it to you as anthropologists, is the way he reads spirit writing. And it's been influential to me in how I'm reading finger sealing in this text. He shows how the spirit writing is crossing semiotic modalities between, that have ontological barrier between them. And they communicate through this material medium, and in this case, the spirit writing. And spirit writing, it really takes advantage of the material possibilities of writing the word down, because once you write it down, you can manipulate it, you can burn it, you can ingest it, you can put it on ink and put it in water. It goes into the body of people. It gets dematerialized, and rematerialized. And I found this spectrum, the way he talks about the materializing and dematerializing of words written on paper during the spirit writing, very inspirational for my own work. And the reason why I find it inspirational, he said that this is analogous to transduction in turbine engines, that you really can tap into through this transformative process. But he's talking about a semiotic modality. Now he's only talking about material things. And what I want to add, and I don't think anybody else has written on this, but I'm sharing this with the world and this audience. So I would like to know if there's other people better than Keen that talk about transduction, because I want to say that somatic transduction also happens, and that the underlying processes of spirit writing that he studies really works well for the healing rituals that I'm writing about and trying to understand in the way they use their hands. So they make visible things that are invisible through the ritualist's body and through the material instruments that they use. And there's a process, embodiment to externalizing, and a disembodiment to re-embodiment in the patient. The earliest example of this kind of process is in a medical text on interdictions, and they have a very specific way of using the hands to press parts of the divisions of your fingers that they call eye, that they believe is a form of treatment external to the healer. Okay. Now, the next examples we have of this come from these Dunhuang caves and the Dunhuang material, dating from the 8th to 9th century, ending in early 11th century. That first Buddhist example I showed you of the two hands with the 10 virtues and the 5 elements comes from this cave, and were excavated, and now many of them exist in the French Bibliothèque Nationale. This manuscript is particularly interesting, Paleo-Chinois 3835. It's a miscellany of all sorts of ritual practices, including these mudra. But the final page has this hand chart, which is integrating all the different dimensions of this book, that the practitioner pays attention to their body, their speech, their mind, and can do the same kind of thing. You touch this part and the snake eye, and it will treat people that have been bitten by a snake or by a bee or a scorpion or affected by a shade. And then the other source that has this kind of knowledge in it comes from a manuscript, probably 8th, 9th century as well. And it's related to a rare cult of this northern Himalayan goddess Janguli. And she's also able to affect change and deal with poisons, etc. She holds in her right hand a sword and another a wooden seal. And when this is the do-it-your-hand manual that I have a manuscript on, I've been reading through. And at the very end, you have very clear instructions. You do this, make the wooden seals with this kind of material. You have to prepare the ritual space in this way. You have to write out the talismans this way. There's additional sealing methods and very detailed analysis of how to use your hands in a finger sealing healing practice. This is a kind of seal at the time, very common in the Chinese bureaucracy, but also in Taoist religion. And just to give you a sense of what those seals look like, that's what we normally think of seals. But therapeutic seals, they not only pressed onto, they didn't press this on paper that then you would imbibe and eat or drink, but also onto the skin, and the hands themselves functioned as seals. And this is called ensigliation, inspired by Michel Strickmann, in which the practitioner believes that pressing these different parts of the fingers call up these spirits or exercise spirits. And these are just some examples I've translated. Get a even more detailed example of how they're thinking about their use of hands in these exorcistic ritual practices. I'm coming to an end. And so I just want to, I find thinking with Keen useful in the way he wrote about spiritual writing, to think about how the healer is embodied. The text is very specific that they need to be possessed by that they will become the female Janguli, that they need to use these seals, which I think of as proxy bodies, and to engage with their clients that way, but also with their fingers in specific ways. And they will print, and that paper will be ingested by the patient, or it will be carried by them in their pockets, et cetera, affecting them in ways. So I'm offering, in contrast, or to not contrast, but to develop further on Keen's focus on material transduction, on somatic transduction. I mean, that's basically how I'm concluding here, that we really need to pay attention to how the body and what kind of instruments, what kind of proxy bodies are being used in those engagements with the client, and how they believe the invisible realm is being made visible in that context. I think I'm going to end to just say that these practices carry on in a very erudite compilation of Chinese medicine by the emperor in the early 12th century. And in this case, I really like on the side, these lines say, in order for the practice to be effective, this kind of finger sealing practices, of course, you need to purify yourself and be disciplined and carry yourself in the right way. Otherwise, you would be a very blunt healing instrument. So the whole body of the practitioner is involved. Thank you.